Hello, everyone, and welcome to Breaking the Spell. We have a really interesting and fascinating guest with us tonight, and that is Ian James Kidd, a assistant professor at the Department of Philosophy from the University of Nottingham. We have him tonight to talk about an interesting topic, one that's very dear to my heart, misanthropy, which is typically defined as the hatred of men. But tonight we plan to go a lot more deeper and a lot more nuance about this idea. At the same time, I'm also hoping that Ian can bring in some interesting areas of his research interest, such as bias epistemology, exemplarism, Asian philosophy as well. So first thing, Ian, thanks so much for being on our show.
It's a pleasure, Douglas and Santosh. Thank you for having me very much. I look forward to what we're going to discuss.
Cool. So I just want to give a formal introduction first, so just to let everyone know who you are. So Ian James Kidd is assistant professor, as I mentioned, at the Department of Philosophy at the University of Nottingham. His teaching and research interests cover a diverse range of areas from Buddhism, classical Chinese philosophy, healthcare and illness, exemplarism, misanthropy, which we're talking about tonight, pluralism, contingency in science, the nature of the spiritual life, virtues and vices. He also serves on the executive committee of the British Philosophical Association, and he contributes to efforts to improve the intellectual and demographic diversity of philosophy. So, you can see he's got so much duties that we were so grateful to have him on tonight. So that's the formal part. So I want to talk a bit about myself and why I wanted to have Ian on tonight. So as I mentioned, he's going to talk about misanthropy, and it's a topic that's very close to my heart. I stumbled upon Ian's work while just surfing philosophy tube, and I just knew like I had to have him on because the way he expounded on misanthropy is so elaborate, it's so complex, and simply put, it's just too simplistic to assume that misanthropy is just simply about hatred of mankind. And at the same time, I found it easy to understand, and he was even capable of explaining misanthropy to two extraterrestrials. So I leave it to you guys to YouTube that up. I didn't manage to speak to aliens about that. So for tonight, I really wanted to have an unfiltered conversation because my sense of misanthropy is that it's a very gloomy, melancholic topic, and I don't make any apologies for going into this on a personal level. For me, as I was listening to Ian's talks and reading his work as well, like it hit me, right, that I had these feelings from a very, very early age, and that since being someone who went through bullying, ostracization, suicidal, depressive tendencies, things I had in my youth, I always had these feelings of misanthropy. And how I kind of like try to cope with it is that I would actually write fan fiction, and actually I'm somewhat trying to work on a graphic novel of which one of my main characters is a misanthropic superhero. So what I want to say basically is that like I want to talk about this topic on a level that it's not treated like it's an abstract philosophy. Ian talks about like how it's a very transformative. It should be a transformative experience, right? To label oneself or to see oneself as a misanthrope, and how there's a wide range of human responses, emotional responses, from depression, desperation, sadness, loneliness, frustration, and yeah, I went through I still go through that, I guess. So yeah. So anyway, Ian, what I want to say to you is that I'm not sure. Well, you did kind of tell me just now, whether when you given a talk or something like that, whether anyone had come up to you and immediately identify himself or herself as a misanthrope. But what I simply want to say to you is that you've hit on something that I've been looking to explain in myself for a very long time. Everything you said just took the words out of my mouth. And as a metaphor, I feel like I'm in a confession room, like I'm pouring out that yes, I am a misanthrope. Father, I've sinned. So anyway, and actually at the same time, also while reflecting on all this, I could see that my social circle is also made up of different misanthropes. And so again, another theme I want to cover tonight is that it's really not such a rare ideology. The issue I think is, why do we harbor such feelings? The question I want to address is it morally justifiable, which I happen to think it is. Why we shouldn't feel ashamed about having such feelings, and if anything, right, like how can we be more enlightened about the complexities of the human condition? So now, Ian, I now want to ask you my opening question to our guests, which is, when was the first time you realized something was not right with the world? So how about all this, get to know you a little bit better? And you don't have to answer that question necessarily related to misanthropy, but feel free to scope it any way you like.
Sure. Well, first thing is I'm not naturally misanthropic. By nature, by temperament, I'm optimistic, cheerful, I'm upbeat. Generally, I had a very, very positive image of the world. That's probably partly a function of my character, my upbringing, the life I've had so far. Generally, my outlook was generally optimistic and upbeat, aware of the moral problems of the world, but not overwhelmingly aware of them. And the first time I remember this starting to change was a conversation I had during my PhD with a friend of mine who was very, very misanthropic. I didn't quite know what that word meant at the time, but looking back, they were very misanthropic. They had a very negative vision of people. And we would often joke about this, and I would tease my friend for being a misanthrope. And once I just said, why do you have such a negative, bleak image of people? And my friend just smiled and said, because I've met them. And I didn't quite understand what they meant. And my friend explained to me very sensitively that says the world looks very different for someone like you. Says people are nice to you and they're kind to you. People help you out. Because my friend said, of course they do. You're tall, you're white, you're male, you're socially confident, you're intellectually very confident. Of course you think people are nice because they're nice to people like you. But my friend, very, very different set of social identity, says, I see people in a very different way. They're not nice to me. They don't help me. They're not kind to me. And looking back, what my friend was gently emphasizing to me was just how different the world seems to people, depending upon their social identities and locations. And looking back, it was just amazing. I hadn't quite grasped this. I mean, at that point, I'd studied a lot of feminist theory. I was very aware of the sort of points that my friend was making. But those points hadn't yet sunk in to my thinking and feeling about the world. Those ideas were merely abstract. They were concepts I had for thinking about the world, but they weren't at that time shaping how I thought about and experienced the world. And that was, I think, the first turning I had towards misanthropy. That felt realization that actually the world might be experienced extremely differently, even to the point of misanthropy by other people. But still, that idea just sort of floated in the background for a long time, because even though I had the awareness, it was sort of simmering in the background. It wasn't developing in any way. And I think the real decisive turn towards a more philosophical misanthropy was reading some work by a former colleague of mine, David Cooper, who's a retired professor of philosophy at the University of Durham. And he and I have been friends and colleagues for many years. He was one of my teachers. And in 2018, he wrote a book called Animals in Misanthropy. And at the time, I knew that he was very interested in animal ethics. I knew that he was appalled by the awful treatment of animals. But I didn't really know what misanthropy was. But I thought, well, this sounds very interesting. So I printed off a draft chapter of the book that he sent me. And I sat down one day by a lake. And by the end of the first chapter, I had acquired this concept, misanthropy, that crystallized all of these different thoughts and feelings and ideas that had been floating around in my mind, but totally disconnected. Like my awareness that the world seems very different, morally speaking, to different kinds of people. My awareness that although we talk a lot about virtue in philosophy, people seem to have vices and failings as well. My sense that actually there are enormous structural problems with the world. Suddenly there were lots of thoughts and feelings and ideas that crystallized around this single concept of misanthropy. And it was rather revelatory. Suddenly, by the end of that, I think it was only an hour sitting by the river reading, suddenly I had a new concept that gave me an outlook on the world, something that could synthesize these ideas, perspectives, thoughts, that could connect up ideas that I'd had in philosophical ethics and in Buddhism and Chinese philosophy and feminist philosophy. All of those ideas suddenly almost magnetically just locked together. And that was the start of an explicit conversion to misanthropy. So going against my earlier naive optimism, my almost romantic sense that, the world is fundamentally a good place, that sense rapidly crumbled away and was replaced by this more philosophical misanthropy, which is a fusion of emotions and feelings and judgments, ways of thinking about the world, experiences that I've had, experiences that other people have had. All of those things now came together around this concept of misanthropy. So for me, it really was a transformation. It was the abandonment of an old way of looking at the world, which I now recognize to be naive and incomplete and quite biased, and instead coming to what I would regard as a more truthful perception of the moral character of the human world.
Love it. I love it that you could cite that it's just simply reading the book, which I have finished just this morning. And there were passages in it that really struck me as really poignant, especially where he described the ways that animals are systematically brutalized and mistreated in our industrial capitalist system. And the thing is, to me, is that like it's not like we don't know about this. We do know it as a matter of fact, as a kind of a piece of knowledge, that how when we buy, say, a bag, a leather bag, how was that animal actually treated to create that bag and stuff like that, right? And how do we eat our chickens? I mean, how do we even conceive of the quality of life that the chickens then have to be, factory farmed in order for us to be able to eat? So yeah, so it's a really good book. I really encourage anyone to read it as well. So that's one. Ian, I'd like you to, before we go on to expanding on what you just said, right? Can you just help our audience, inform them like what's a good definition of misanthropy? And then from there, I actually want to talk a little bit, which is one of my questions I've prepared. It's about vices and failings.
Well, I think that misanthropy is condemnation of humankind. It's condemnation of the overall moral character of humankind, of the human species, or of human life. The misanthrope thinks that collectively we human beings are awful and dreadful and deserve condemnation. So it's not necessarily hatred of people. That's one way of feeling about the judgment. It's very natural to often feel hatred for people that you can condemn. But I don't think that hatred is necessarily part of misanthropy. So if I look in my dictionary, it says misanthropy is the hatred of human beings. But I don't think that's right at all. I think essentially misanthropy is a condemnation of humanity. It's a judgment or a verdict that our overall moral condition is dreadful, extremely dreadful. And in this, I'm following the lead of David Cooper. And I think that that's fundamentally what misanthropy is. The misanthrope isn't making a judgment of individual people. They're not pretending that they've interviewed all 7.5 billion people on this planet. The misanthrope is making a claim about human life, human structures, the ways that we live together, the ways that we arrange and organize our life, the whole complicated thing called humanity, with all of its activities, practices, institutions, and ambitions. That is what the misanthrope is condemning. They're not necessarily saying that all of it's dreadful everywhere. A misanthrope can accept that there are pockets of goodness, and they can accept that we have quite a messy moral complexion. So they're not denying the possibility of goodness at all. Some misanthropes might be like that, but most of them think that overall, a sober judgment of humankind will come out with a verdict that we are collectively morally dreadful, because human life, as it's come to be, is just soaked through with a whole range of vices and failings, not just a few vices and failings here and there scattered around the world, that these vices and failings are deeply built into what has come to be human life. And maybe a good example of this that seems to work with people is claims made by many environmentalists. So when environmentalists criticize contemporary forms of human life, they often say that human life is violent, wasteful, exploitative, unsustainable, greedy. Now, they're not making a judgment necessarily about individual people. They're making claims about how we arrange and organize our societies. Maybe they're saying that in carbon-intensive, carnist societies, premised upon the burning of fossil fuels and the systematic destruction of animals, that way of life deserves to be morally condemned because it's violent, destructive, wasteful, and so on. And I would count those people as eco-misanthropes because they're making a moral condemnation at the forms of human life that we currently inhabit, because they're, dominated by capitalism, carnism, carbon-intensive economies, whatever. But they're making a sort of misanthropic judgment. Overall, looked at from the perspective of animals in the natural world, human existence as we know it is dreadful. And that's one form of misanthropy. And I suppose what I want to do is to expand that to say, well, what's dreadful about human beings is not just how we treat animals in the natural world. It's much broader than that. That's one dimension of misanthropy. But misanthropy can be much, much broader than that. So the book I mentioned by David Cooper, Animals and Misanthropy, his way into misanthropy is by looking at our treatment of animals. For other misanthropes, it's how we treat the natural world. And for other misanthropes, it's how we treat one another. So there are lots of ways into misanthropy, but the general characteristic is the misanthrope is condemning the overall moral character of human life as we know it. That's what deserves condemnation. And that condemnation can express itself with lots of emotions. It might be anger, sadness, disappointment, regret, frustration, depression, or gloom. And you can act on that judgment in many ways. You can roll up your sleeves and try to do something about it. You can be an activist. You can resign yourself to the fact that we're so dreadful and so far gone, nothing can be done. And so you try to keep your head down and live quietly within the world. Some misanthropes get very angry. They talk about tearing down the human world. There are lots of eco-misanthropes like that. And others want to escape the human world, to flee, to get far away from us because we're so violent and destructive. So there are many ways to be a misanthrope, but the fundamental feature is it's a condemnation, a judgment of humankind as it's come to be. That's what I think the core of misanthropy is.
Yeah, and I'm really fascinated with the way you've dug up all kinds of sources of misanthropy writings in different branches of philosophy and theology as well, Christianity, Buddhism, Daoism, if I got it right? So I was just like blown away that you had such a novel way of reading this text. And so I definitely want to get into it later as to why, even from something that seems as benign as Christianity, if I'm not wrong, you can still get a misanthropic kind of reading from it. But my next question, which I want to set up, because I love like how in your talk you always put it like misanthropy confronts the question of vices and failings. And what I'm interested to ask you is that whether there is a meaningful distinction between the two terms. So I could be very wrong about this, but just want to hear me out. So my sense is that failings are kind of conceptually different from vices because I guess there's less moral culpability in failings. It sounds to me like someone may be meaningfully trying to do good in the world, but it may come up short. And it may be due to lack of ability, resources, character, charisma, reputation. Whereas vices, yes, they are definitely a form of failings, but it sounds a bit more deliberate, like someone's willing and consciously deciding to be perhaps a more greedy, more close-minded, more selfish person. And the reason why I want to talk about this because in my readings of certain philosophical thoughts, like say Stoicism, sometimes the assumption is made that they will look at someone of evil and they'll say that person suffers from lack of wisdom. And I'm not really quite contented with that. I feel that that's quite simplistic of a reading, that if someone is committing something viceful, that's just due to lack of knowledge. So I understand that egoistically, we all think that we're all good moral beings. But if you leave it at that, I feel like we're very susceptible to moral relativism. So I'm just going to ask you, am I onto something here, or it's just complete hogwash?
Interesting. Yes, there's an old remark by the Greek writer Plutarch. He said, "He who hates vices hates mankind." And I take that as a good slogan for a misanthrope, because if you're going to condemn humankind, obviously you need criteria for condemning people. Rather like with a crime, you can't just say to someone, "You've committed a crime." You have to say which crime they've committed. You need criteria for condemnation. And historically, it's been very popular for people to use concepts like vices and failings. I suppose the difference I see between those two concepts is this, that failing is a very, very broad category, whereas vices are a particular kind of failing. So in the book I'm writing on misanthropy, my suggestion is that vices are individual level failings, whereas failings themselves can be very broad. So societies can have failings of all sorts of kinds, but vices are the individual forms of those failings. So to go back to the example of the eco-misanthrope, they might condemn, modern industrial societies for their greediness. So that's a general failing of our society. It's built into our economic and our political and our social structures. We buy too much, we throw away too much, and so on. This is collectively a greedy society. But of course, greediness can also be a vice of individual people. So there are some people who are individually very, very greedy. And that means that there's a sort of a parallel between the failings of a society and the vices of its individual members. And that's how I tend to think about it. Vices are individual level failings. They're failings of character. failings of individual people, whereas we can just talk more generally of the failings of societies or institutions. You know, we might talk about, for example, a university being very inefficient or not being very transparent. Those would be failings of the institution. And I suppose the misanthrope says that human life as we know it is dominated by all sorts of failings. Some of those will be reflected in individual people. So if you live in a very violent, corrupt society, you'll expect many of the individual people in the society also to be violent and corrupt. But for the misanthrope, failing is, if you like, the super category. That includes all of our different failings, including the individual level failings. And I suppose one advantage of using the word failing is that it points to a much broader range of things that can be wrong with human life. So at least in Western moral philosophy, when people talk about vices, they usually mean a range of moral vices like cruelty, selfishness, dishonesty. And yes, they're obvious moral failings. The problem is that there are lots of other failings of human beings that wouldn't really count as moral vices. These might include, for example, aesthetic failings like being a Philistine or having no sensitivity to beauty, or, you know, being snobbish. Those don't sound like moral vices, but they are failings of individual people. You know, if you have no sensitivity at all to beauty, I think that's a failing of a person. There could be spiritual failings as well, like impiety or a lack of respect for God. There can be epistemic failings as well, like dogmatism, arrogance, closed-mindedness, insensitivity to evidence. And so I think what to do, be a misanthrope, you need to widen the range of these failings away from the narrow category of moral vices into the whole range of moral, aesthetic, spiritual, political, and other vices, and then expand it out again into a broader range of other failings that don't sound like vices at all. For example, ignorance in many cases is not a vice really, but it's often going to be a failing because there's certain sorts of knowledge and understanding you need to get around in the world. So ignorance is not a vice, but it can be generated by vices like arrogance and closed-mindedness. So I think there are lots of things wrong with individual people that aren't vices. Likewise, I think there are lots of things wrong with societies that go way beyond the moral failings like cruelty and injustice. And the misanthrope will say, once you start this process of broadening your mind away from specifically moral failings into a whole range of failings, including lots of failings we don't even have names for yet, then you'll start to move into a misanthropic verdict, because you realize that what's wrong with human societies is not just cruelty and injustice, it's a huge, enormous range of failings. And once you start to stack up all of these different failings, then you are on the way to a misanthropic verdict of human life. So I think vices are individual level failings, but the category of failings can be applied to groups of people, institutions, and ultimately to human life itself. And that's vital for the misanthrope, that you can condemn human life for having a whole range of failings.
Yeah, and that's why actually on this channel, right, it's quite evident that someone like me is kind of an eco-misanthrope because I'm very passionate about climate change, environmental destruction, animal extinction. And, you know, I've been, you know, my head is in the clouds. I've been reading so much literature about climate change, what's the psychology of it, you know, what can we do to inspire people to take it more seriously. And, you know, so I'm just going to make this more real, right, which is, I have friends, I have people who I know clearly do care about climate change, but it's to me a moral failing on their part to not take it much more seriously, or that perhaps they put it out of their minds because they got to focus on more important issues of the day. And, you know, that's the thing about, for me as a misanthrope, I can't condemn them in a vicious kind of manner because I don't feel like as if they want this to happen. They want climate change to go on unabated, and they would definitely love to feel like they can do their part to be more participating and contributing to society, but they just feel like they can't do it. And I think it's the structures, I think it's the ideology that clouds us, that overwhelms us and indoctrinates us. And perhaps also this can get into another area I'd like to talk to you about, which is the difference between a misanthrope and what's the opposite? Philanthrope, right? Is that right? Yeah. So I feel like, you know, for the philanthrope, it's a kind of zeitgeist that exists in society that tells us that not to worry, right? We will progress, we will make things right. Things can look very horrible right now, and you can find pockets of violence and disarray and misery, but it's just pockets, you know, overwhelmingly, You don't have to worry about it as long as we progress forward. And typically, I think what David E. Cooper said is right. Is typically true. The ideas of scientism, humanism, and I can't remember the other one, but he identifies this kind of like ideological vehicles to kind of pacify and make us feel better that we can actually still progress. I want to ask you, like, how do you combat with someone that tells you that you are wrong, that tells you that perhaps the way you're looking at society isn't right, that perhaps you're not using the right data, that perhaps it's even better, even if you are right, to not say it, to not express this, because it might actually lead to dampening of spirits. Yeah.
Yes, that's an interesting challenge for a misanthrope. It's interesting that there's a tradition amongst some critics of misanthropy to treat it as a feature of individual personality. They'll say, well, this isn't a philosophical position. This is just a very gloomy person. Or they'll treat it as pathological, a sign that something is mentally wrong with you, as if the only reason that you could take seriously a misanthropic vision of life would be if you had some sort of psychiatric illness. Now, of course, that's a terrible way to deal with philosophical positions. It's problematic for many reasons. But people do the same with philosophical pessimism as well. So the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, was a philosophical pessimist. He has a complex account of why human life is just hostile to flourishing and happiness. And people say, well, this was because he was famously a very gloomy, miserable man. But of course, that doesn't work at all. The question of what his personality was like is separate from the question of what his philosophy is like. It might be the case that he's a gloomy person and that informed his philosophy. But then again, he doesn't root his pessimism in his psychology. And there are plenty of other philosophical pessimists who are not at all temperamentally gloomy people. And that way of trying to pathologize or psychologize philosophical positions, to treat them merely as expressions of individual psychology, that I think is uncompelling. What you should do, which is what you said there, Douglas, is to look at the arguments for it. So for instance, suppose you're confronted with someone who says, look, this pessimism is exaggerated, it's overblown, it's inflated, things aren't that bad. Well, I suppose one thing you can do there is to say, well, really? Is that the case? So here we can think about, for instance, human treatment of the environment. Now, as everybody knows who follows climate news, most of the data is extremely depressing. The amount of polar ice is declining over time. The rates of species extinction are increasing, habitat loss is increasing, the amount of pollution of air and water is increasing, there's vast amounts of microplastics in the ocean, and so on and so on and so on. I mean, these sorts of empirical claims about what the world is like are so common, I don't even need to go into details of them. So that's one way that you can respond to someone who rejects misanthropy for being too gloomy. Say, well, look at the data from the ground. I mean, do you think that our world is characterized by fairness and justice and kindness? Because, when I look through the newspapers, when I read UN reports, it really doesn't seem like that. It really does seem that the world is in a pretty dreadful state. So that's one of the ways you can respond to the misanthrope, is that you engage with the evidence. Another way you could do it, I suppose, is by looking at the sorts of arguments people give for being optimistic philanthropes. So there are plenty of writers these days who try to make the case that although, yes, there's a lot wrong with the world, still, it is getting better and it's going to get more better over time. And then you can read those people and see, well, are their arguments any good? So one example here is the Danish writer Rutger Bregman. Now, he wrote a book which came out last year called Humankind. And the title is a pun. He suggests that although human beings have their problems, overall, we're very kind creatures. As he says in one of his puns, Homo sapiens are really Homo puppies, because like puppies, we are by nature kind, gentle, playful, trusting, and so on. And so I read Bregman as being a philanthrope. He's the anti-misanthrope. He thinks we're pretty good and we're getting better. Now, like many of his other critics, I find that very uncompelling. I don't think the arguments work. So here's one of his arguments. He says that if you look at results in cultural anthropology, you'll find that actually by nature, human beings are pro-social, we are disposed to form communities, etc., etc., etc. And he offers a claim about human nature to support his philanthropy. Now, maybe he's right about human nature. Maybe he's wrong. But the thing is, that's completely irrelevant to the question of misanthropy, because the misanthrope is not making a claim about human nature. They're not saying human nature is evil and corrupt, therefore the world is dreadful. The misanthrope doesn't need to say anything at all about human nature, because what they're making a claim about is the current forms of human life as we know them. They are what is violent, corrupt, selfish, etc. Now, it might be the case that our natures are very good and generous, but that's irrelevant, because the misanthrope's not judging human nature. So if Bregman's argument is human nature is good, therefore philanthropy is true, well, that doesn't work. Maybe human nature is good. Maybe we are by nature, deep down, kind and selfish, kind and generous creatures. But the world that we've created, the world that we've inherited, that world is violent, selfish, and destructive, despite our best natures. And actually, at several points in the book, Bregman notes this. He says, for instance, that human beings are very, very resistant to harming and killing others of their kind. And he points to some interesting data from military psychologists who point out it's actually really, really hard to train soldiers to kill members of the other side. You have to work quite hard to do this. And Bregman says, well, look, that's an example of just how good we are by nature. But then again, of course, about 100 pages later in the book, he also then emphasizes that the history of military technology is the effort to overcome this resistance through long-range weapons like archery and bows and rifles and drone strikes, strategies for dehumanizing your enemies and your opponents so that you don't even see them as human beings. So maybe by nature, we're very resistant to kill, but we've also become very good at training people to kill very, very effectively. And so that's an example, I think, of a philanthropic argument that doesn't work. The misanthrope's not saying that we are good or bad by nature. Our human nature is completely irrelevant to the question of humankind as we know it. So that argument, I think, is very, very uncompelling. And I suppose that's what you could do for other philanthropes like Steven Pinker. You can go through their arguments and you can see whether the arguments themselves are any good. And I think what you often find with philanthropes is that they leave out certain kinds of data, they rely on narrow definitions, and all of these lead to dodgy forms of philanthropy. So the famous example in Pinker's case, in his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, is he has this big claim that we are making marvelous moral progress. Now, what he turns out to mean is that the rates of interpersonal violence are declining over time. Now, that might be true, but the misanthrope will say two things. First of all, that's not the only kind of violence. So there is interpersonal violence, like one person punching or stabbing or killing another. But there are different kinds of violence. So in many countries, a lot of the violence is built into state institutions. It's built into the healthcare system, economic arrangements, the legal system, the police, the prisons. The violence is part of the system. It's part of the political arrangement of a society. But Pinker barely talks about that. Second thing the misanthrope emphasizes is the vices of violence are only some of our vices. So sure, maybe we're becoming less violent and brutal, but where's the evidence that we're becoming less selfish, less callous, less dogmatic, less closed-minded? There's a whole range of different vices and failings you have to look at. And maybe we are becoming less violent, but violence isn't the only thing that's wrong with us. So the fact we're becoming less violent doesn't mean that we're getting better overall. If you'd written a history of other vices like cruelty or selfishness or narcissism or self-righteousness, you get a very different picture. So you can challenge their evidence, but you can also challenge the arguments. And that, I think, will generally show that things aren't as good as these folks are saying. There might be local, particular improvements here and there, but the idea that there's an overall trend towards progress, I don't think is supported by the evidence that we have about humankind's actual moral performance. I think generally, actually, we're pretty bad. And in many respects, we're getting much worse.
So before I practice a vice of not being charitable, Santosh, do you have something to add first before I reply to Ian?
Yeah, a lot of what you've shared, Ian, and a lot of what this discussion has been centered on reminded me of the works of two people who I've been following. First, it's Thomas Hubel, who wrote a book, Healing Collective Trauma. And the second one is Gabor Mate, who came up with a series called The Wisdom of Trauma. Essentially, both speakers slash movie directors speak of this whole idea of intergenerational and cultural trauma that we've all been subjected to and that we are living out in very unconscious ways. And we're not even aware of what's happening to all of us. And we are acting out of this unconscious traumas that we all carry with us. It's been transmitted intergenerationally from ancestors to our forefathers, to our parents, and then to us. And culturally, within the cultural context, the rise of the nation state, for example, capitalism, the Industrial Revolution. So with the compounding effects of intergenerational and cultural trauma, this allows us to view the idea of pathology, which is not intrinsically in a person, to something that's more collective at the energetic level, something that's more at the cultural and collective level. And so the shift by Dr. Gabor Mate is this very powerful shift. Instead of telling people what's wrong with you when you're treating them logically, reframe that question to what happened to you. What were the circumstances and the environmental factors and the trauma from the systems and the structures, structural racism, for example, for those who have gone through an episode of racial trauma, for example. Yeah. So there's a very big shift, and shifting the blame and the pathology, or where the root cause of the problem is, from the individual, which is what's wrong with the individual, and condemning the individual, to creating a space for healing the underlying structures and the culture that's caused the very trauma that we see in the individual. And this has taken off globally. It's a global phenomenon right now. And it's very healing. People have found tremendous amount of healing going back on their own traumatic journey. And so this is where it links to, so this is the first idea of the work that I'm doing, which is healing collective trauma. So we come together in communities and we talk about the pains and the struggles that we faced. And in that space of shared vulnerability, there's this level of regulation and attunement, which allows for healing to take place. A lot of the healing unlocks because we move away from a space of shame and guilt, where I'm the problem, to what happened to me. And that allows us to grieve and to heal collectively. And that's why misanthropy is very useful as a philosophy, to back this whole idea of healing collective trauma. So we become actually kinder, gentler, and more humane creatures on this planet. So that's one thing that I've realized in the work that I've done in the sociological context, when we're looking at social activism, for example. Yeah. Now, on the psychological and the spiritual front, I've got some major advancements that I've made, like in my spiritual journey, as well as in my psychological journey. When you introduced the idea of misanthropy, it just clicked. Like the progress I've made significantly in, let's say, the psychological work of therapy, it's shadow work. I've begun to actually shine light and awareness on the shadows, not just individual shadows that have been hidden in my closets, to the collective shadows of humanity. And that's allowed me to heal significantly. And on the spiritual front, in my meditative journey, a lot of the work and the progress of meditation has been a result of being able to confront difficult emotions that I've suppressed and repressed, as a result of not being able to accept that human beings and humanity has erred. So that is how I found misanthropy as a very powerful vehicle to promote societal collective healing, number one. Secondly, psychological healing at the therapy level. And thirdly, spiritual evolution, which is going deeper in states of meditation, where we feel calmer and at peace with ourselves and with the world. And a lot of this, I think, is a result of this underlying shift in the belief system, where we set a lower bar for both ourselves and for humanity. With that lower bar for ourselves and for humanity, we begin to be much more kinder to ourselves and to everyone else. With low expectations, that paves the way for an increased sense of individual and collective well-being. It's experiential. So if I can see how a philosophical ideology such as misanthropy can lead to experiential shifts in one's individual and collective sense of well-being. So those were just some of my observations. Yeah.
Okay, I'd really like to hear your response to this.
That's interesting, Santosh. I hadn't thought about the connections to the collective trauma. I suppose that a concept of trauma would capture something about the experiences of many misanthropes, which is their recognition that one of the dreadful things about living within such a systematically corrupt culture is that living in it will have destructive moral effects upon you. So the misanthrope says the world is not just corrupt, it's also corrupting. The process of living within the world itself can morally damage you, because insofar as you live within a world like this, your moral character would be put under constant pressure. There's a constant fear and anxiety that you yourself are being morally damaged. So the Buddha offers metaphors like the world is poisonous, the world is burning and burning and burning with hatred and greed and delusion. And for those sorts of misanthropes, there is a sort of morally traumatic realization that the mere fact of being a part of this sort of world is itself morally destructive. This sort of culture not only has failings, it feeds your own vices. It encourages your violence, greediness, hatred, selfishness, and so on. And at the same time, it makes it very, very, very difficult for you to cultivate and nurture the virtues, because so many of our virtues are inconsistent with the wider character of our society. And it does seem to me that some historical misanthropes do experience a sort of traumatic experience, particularly the misanthropes that Kant calls fugitives from humankind, the ones who realize that the human world is violent and destructive physically and also morally. And he says they become overwhelmed with a sense of fear and anxiety. They don't want to remain in the human world anymore because they now recognize that it is destructive and corrupting. And their response, he says, is to try and escape from the world. They might literally flee to a distant valley or a monastery or a secluded community. And it seems to me that what they're seeking when they escape are opportunities not just to escape from the corrupting effects, but they're seeking out small communities of people who share their moral fears and anxieties and who are trying to work together to repair the moral damage that they've suffered, and also to try, to use your phrase, to morally heal as well. And this, I think, is something that you see in the Buddha's remarks on monastic communities. When he emphasizes the superiority of monastic life, it's mainly because monastic life isn't as corrupting as the mainstream human world. So the Buddha says, the world of householders, of ordinary people, is violent, selfish, greedy, corrupting, dishonest. It's morally unregulated. He says it's poisonous and dangerous. You don't want to go out there. You want to join a monastery, because what you find within a monastery is a small community of people who share moral aspirations, like the commitment to the Dharma, people with the moral energy and discipline to follow the practices and the precepts, and people who are working together towards a common spiritual aim, where the aim is ultimately to achieve moksha and nibbana, but where the short-term aim is repairing their own damaged, unwholesome characters and personalities. And I think you could probably describe those fugitive misanthropes as people trying to cope with a certain kind of moral trauma, partly through moral and spiritual practices within small, dedicated communities. And I suppose you can also see efforts to cope with trauma in other misanthropes, the ones I call activist misanthropes. They're the ones who are traumatized by the experience of living within the human world, which is so violent and brutal. But their response is not to retreat inwards and try to purify their own characters. Their response to trauma is, well, let's try to improve the world through large-scale radical projects. Let's try to reform the world. So many eco-misanthropes are also environmental activists. They want to reform the world so that, crudely, it's less traumatizing to be in it. And maybe you could think about all the different kinds of misanthropy as ways of trying to cope with a certain experience of moral trauma that is living within a world which is structurally dominated by vices and failings, so many and so overwhelming that it's almost a pain to live within it. And maybe the challenge then at the individual level for misanthropes is what coping strategies are available to you, because there's clearly variety. You get someone like Kongzi, so if you read the Analects, he describes a whole range of very painful emotions that express what it was like for him to live within a corrupted society. So, a lot of the time, Kongzi is devoting himself to teaching and preaching. He tries to talk to rulers. He tries to do good things. But a lot of the time, he's also frustrated and despaired. He says, I should just give up. I should just abandon everything. I should build a raft and sail away into the ocean. I should just give up. Heaven has abandoned me. And he has a real profound sense of distress and perhaps a form of trauma at his really powerful experience that I live within a corrupted, morally awful world. And there's so little I can do about it. And maybe there's nothing I can do about it. And even if I did change the world for the better, it still won't be the really ideal human world where my ideals could flourish. I've always got to settle for second best. And one way of reading Kongzi's philosophy is a constant act of trying to settle for an imperfect world that is dreadful and is very resistant to being improved. And even if you could improve it, it would never become ideal or perfect. It would always be second best and unsatisfying. And there's very interesting work on Confucian philosophy by Emil, and she articulates his philosophy in terms of maybe a sort of coping with trauma, the traumatic experience of being a person with very profound moral ideals, which are very sincere and very rich, but recognizing they're never going to be realized. The world is too far gone. The world has lost the way. And even if all of my disciples worked for 1,000 years, the world would never be in good condition. And I suppose there's a sort of trauma and a sort of grief for many misanthropes in recognizing that in this sort of world, my ideals will never be realized. And experiencing the death of those possibilities is deeply traumatic. It's a sort of grief. And that, I think, is the state of many misanthropes. And I suppose this takes us back to a point that Douglas mentioned earlier, that, there is an element of existential power in misanthropy. These reflections on the awfulness of humankind, these are not abstract. Once they sink in and transform your world, you will then become susceptible to experiences of grief or trauma, profound loss and frustration, the realization that the world that you've been living in so happily suddenly has all of these painful, destructive structures all around you that you'd never seen before, but now it's all you can see. And there's a real emotional and moral and existential complexity to that, which I think is part of the interest of misanthropy. It's not a cold philosophical doctrine. It's a potentially life-transformative experience with very many negative implications.
Yeah, and when I read, and of course you just expounded on how Kongzi felt, I was, blown away, because I was like thinking, oh my gosh, I'm feeling the same way. I asked myself questions as to why am I even doing this channel? Why do I not just try to lead a life of just quietism, fugitivism, get away from the world, just enrich myself? I'm a poor guy. It's amazing to me that you've been able to dig so deep into this kind of sources of philosophy, which, at least to my knowledge, I haven't heard anyone, no specialist in Chinese philosophy that has at least shared this kind of readings. I want to do a few things, because there was so much you said I want to respond to. I read the Rutger Bregman book. I at first loved it. And I also think that perhaps people should be a bit more, what's the word for it? Maybe lenient is the right word. The idea to me, actually, I think with what Rutger wrote is that human nature is, it has potential to be a homo puppy, but it clearly needs a lot of work, to exercise that. And I actually found that one chapter of the book was quite paradoxical. It was the chapter of the book where he said, when you look at the way the Germans were fighting and how, if I recall correctly, the details, even if they were at the state of defeat, the Nazis were just banded together, were stronger, there was camaraderie. And to me, that actually speaks to the irony of empathy and even good virtues like comradeship. It depends a lot on the content. Are you banding together to fight for a just cause? Or are you fighting for a really lousy and vicious cause, right? So I think that's the contradictory nature of human beings. Ian, I want to hit you with a excerpt. So I actually prepared this and I want your reactions. And it actually goes back to my earlier question about what to say to the philanthrope. So I'm going to read this, which I prepared. So George Monbiot, right, Guardian writer for the Guardian environmental writer, who I don't consider to be a misanthrope, he cried on the segment of Good Morning Britain not too long ago, just a couple of days ago. And the reason why he did that was because he was defending the actions of activists from Insulate Britain. And he was pleading, and I'm quoting from him, what they're desperately trying to say is that the time is running out on the greatest crisis we've ever faced. So subsequently, he tweeted that he's effing sick of being told that he must be mentally ill because he cried on air, and being told he's a melt, he's a snowflake, and he was being instructed to man up. And he responded that it's hard for most of us to comprehend that some people are motivated by hatred of others, and this hatred can become the defining feature of their politics. But we have to confront it, we have to comprehend it and confront it, not with hatred of our own, but with solidarity and determination. Now, I want to contrast that, that's George Monbiot, with David Suzuki, who is a Canadian academic environmental activist. And I found this 2018 YouTube interview he had with a capitalist entrepreneur, and he bemoaned that he was making an observation about human beings, that we would rather buy high-priced pre-ripped jeans as a fashion statement than treat clothes as a resource that should be durable and keep us warm. So he was completely flabbergasted that people would pay $400 for a pre-worn pair of jeans. And he said this, he lamented, what kind of species are we? And he told his interviewer that human beings are the only species that don't care about their own children, because we don't even love our own children enough to act in the best interest of them. And this is apparently what he said, he told the Prime Minister of Canada Administrative Environment. And, I think that is the predicament that, well, at least for the environmental activists in this case, what they face, because I feel like if they're upfront publicly and emotionally about climate grief and anxiety, they get a lot of pushback, and then they get told that they are the problem. And so instead of being acknowledged for telling uncomfortable truths about our predicament, they become the recipients of hate. And what happens then is that they have to put up this front that, oh, we've got to get together, we've got to be, act in solidarity and all that. And that's really the panacea, which I don't really think it is. But on the other hand, I actually like what David Suzuki communicated, because I feel like it's exemplary of a moral failing that we honestly need to pay more serious attention to, and undertake more serious effort to reflect and work on. And perhaps we need to also recognize, and this is me saying as a misanthrope, that all sorts of people, whether it's politicians, elites, even members of the working class, not everyone's in solidarity with this mission to try to improve the state of mankind and our relations to the human world. So I'm curious to hear what you think of what I just said.
Interesting. I mean, maybe this underscores one point about human nature, which is that it's always going to be a mistake to treat human nature as being too crudely sort of good or bad. So there's a long track record of giving very one-sided accounts of human nature. So for example, Thomas Hobbes or maybe Richard Dawkins, human nature is violent, selfish, competitive, it's out for itself. For others, they take the opposite extreme. Human nature is fundamentally good and empathetic and social. Whereas it just seems, very obvious that actually human nature, if you want to use that concept, is extremely messy and very, very dappled. We're not selfish or selfless. We're a complex mixture of these things. We have selfish and selfless streaks. We're not wise or wicked. We have elements of wisdom and wickedness in our nature. We are shot through with all sorts of different tendencies, messily interacting together. And this was a point that was made by the British philosopher Mary Midgley in the late 1970s in her book Beast and Man. Says there's a consistent tendency for people to introduce narrow, one-sided accounts of human nature. Says the really obvious thing about human beings, if you spend any time with them, is that they have very messy natures and therefore very conflicting needs, desires, and interests. So for example, take the example of care for children. Now, there's a big difference, isn't there, between immediate acts of care for your child, like feeding them, protecting them, rushing to help them when the child wanders into a road. That's immediate and direct. And, many parents, maybe most parents, will naturally perform those acts of care. But that's very, very different from thinking about the long-term consequences of your actions 40, 50, 60, 70 years from now of things like you're driving a car and flying in planes. I mean, there's a moral and a psychological difference between those cases. So the parent who, really cares for their children, but then also drives a car and burns fossil fuels, they're not somehow in contradiction, because, there is a moral difference between short and long-term actions. Likewise, human nature contains, it seems, a whole variety of dispositions, some of which are not necessarily morally good or bad, but they are features of human beings. So think here of our common preference for simple stories and easy explanations. That in itself is not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes it's very useful. Sometimes you want easy explanations. But in other cases, what you really need is a very complicated story. So this is a neutral disposition of human beings that can point us towards virtuous or vicious patterns of action. Or think about the common preference of many human beings for short-term thinking. This is very well established in the psychological literature. Many people will prefer short-term gains to much more advanced longer-term gains. And when you put all these things into the picture, you have a much, much messier idea about what human beings are like morally, which complicates the sorts of cases maybe that Monbiot and Suzuki were describing there. For example, clearly some people find it very easy to become emotionally moved by events that have not yet happened 20, 40, 50, 100 years from now, whereas other people don't have that ability. Some people's emotional responsiveness doesn't stretch over decades, and it doesn't reach into possible futures. Whereas other people like Monbiot, they really feel that very, very acutely. And this is partly to emphasize the messiness of human beings and just how variable we are. I mean, this does seem to me one feature that's very distinctive to human beings as a species is that we're extremely heterogeneous, we're extremely variable. Other animals, as the Taoists say, seem to have quite well-defined limited natures. You don't see tigers trying to, swim in the ocean. You don't see animals trying to inhabit very, very different ways of life. Whereas human beings have remarkable variety. There are so many ways of being a human being, and they're messy and complicated and unstable. And this, I think, makes misanthropy, again, very interesting. It emphasizes just how messy we are and how difficult it is for us to be good sorts of creatures, considering this messy inheritance we have. I'm sure many people have dispositions to be kind, generous, and empathetic, but those dispositions get massively structured and limited by the forms of life available to us. So think here about our tendencies to form social groups. Well, that includes our tendencies to out-group behaviors, to form our social group by separating it from those social groups. I think there's a very nice book, I don't remember the author, called Against Empathy. And he makes this reasonable warning. That's the one, yes. This reasonable warning that empathy is not a uniformly good quality, because it's also part of the scaffolding for many of our worst tendencies, like xenophobia and social exclusion. And I think that's one reason why a misanthrope should just stay away from the topic of human nature. Our nature is so messy, complex, and ambivalent, it's not going to settle the issue of whether we're fundamentally good or bad. Fundamentally, we're very messy, dappled, mixed creatures. And that partly explains why things tend to go bad as they do. So much of our behavior gets driven by the structures and forms of life available to us. Forms of life which tell us these are the people you empathize with, and these are the people you turn away from. These are the people you help, and these are the people you hurt. These are the people you should be concerned with, and these are the people you should totally ignore. This, for the misanthrope, this is why you focus on structures, not on human nature. Because, as the Buddha would say, our behavior is conditioned by the forms of life that we live in. And that's, I think, why the misanthrope will say, let's just focus on those forms of life as they are and not go down into our natures.
So I really agree with you on that line of argument, because I think David Cooper also makes the same line of argument as well, right? Because he says it doesn't really matter. Well, actually, then again, let me correct myself a little bit, because I actually think that from philosophers like David Cooper, and I'm going to bring another person, John Gray, they actually make the argument in the sense that we can look at animal beings, if we can compare their characters and how we can learn a lot from animals. So John Gray even has a book called Feline Philosophy, where he advocates that we should learn from felines and adopt, I actually wrote it down somewhere, but the idea is that he said we should adopt certain values. And I know one of it is definitely not about pursuing happiness, and the other is just not to take life too seriously. So in any case, the whole book was really about how you can look at a cat and you can admire virtues of the cat nature and how it can be a good supplement to human living. And I know for David Cooper, he definitely makes the argument that when we look at animals, there's certain exemplary virtues. I know he brought the example of a dog, how you can look at a dog and can examine the attributes of dog nature, and we can practice emulation, as I recall, as the last chapter of his book, so that we can fashion ourselves to be better human beings. Yeah. There is one thing I wanted to say about the stances. So I think by now you would have elaborated all four of them, if I'm not wrong, to now in our conversation. So anyway, I just have this very funny anecdotal commentary on stances. So I practice martial arts. And stances are a very old-fashioned word in martial arts discipline, because only in the traditional arts you still find martial artists practicing stances. And there's actually by now kind of an enlightened understanding that stances are just forms, they're just patterns, but you really practice it just for knowledge accumulation and just kind of respect for the art. But really by now, sophisticated or enlightened martial artists, they don't treat the learning of stances to be adaptable to the real world. And as the famous Bruce Lee said, to be a good martial artist, you have to empty your mind, flow, and be like water, which of course many people adapt to be a universal epigraph about life itself. So actually, I like the part which you mentioned in some of your talks, that the stances are not rigid. They're not just kind of like this positions that you hold on to for dear life, and that really the sophisticated misanthrope would actually shift and wrestle between these different stances. I'd like to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so one of the difficulties in studying misanthropy is there really is not very much philosophical literature on misanthropy. It's not a concept that many philosophers would use. It's not a subject for which there is a very large literature. I mean, I've mentioned David Cooper's book, Animal Misanthropy. There's a few papers he's written. There's some of the papers I've written. There's a couple more forthcoming papers by Lisa Gerber and Kate Norlock and Raja Halwani, but there's not really much on misanthropy. In fact, when I got started, there was only David's book and another book by Andrew Gibson, who's a literary historian and scholar, called Misanthropy. So there's not much to go on. And that means that when you start to study it as a philosopher, you need some framework. And my framework was thinking about these stances, these different ways of being a misanthrope. And Immanuel Kant, the great Prussian philosopher, he named two: the enemy of mankind, who hates us and wants to do violence, the fugitive who fears us and wants to escape. And then these other stances that I call the activist and the quietist. One problem, of course, is that this can be quite a rigid structure. You can think, oh, so misanthropy breaks down into these four different stances and that's it. Now, that's clearly not the case. For one thing, you can mix and match these stances. You can merge elements of them. So in my reading of early Buddhism, what you find is a combination of the quietist stance and the fugitive stance, because there's such emphasis in the Buddha's teachings on the importance of joining the Sangha, undergoing monastic discipline. You adopt these more quietistic ways of life. You restrain your appetites and desires. You remove your attachments. You live in these morally quietistic ways. And that's a preparation ultimately for achieving release from the samsaric cycle. So the Buddhism, I think, is a sort of quietism, fugitivism. Whereas I think Kongzi is an example of someone who's an activist quietist. For much of his life, he's working as an activist. He's trying to initiate radical reforms of his society through big projects. But in the course of his life, realizes they're not succeeding, I'm not having any effect, and things are getting worse. So he has various remarks where he says, 10 years ago, this prime minister would have at least given me an audience and listened to me, whereas nowadays he just turns me away. Says, some of the states that used to be pretty good are now declining. And so towards the end of his life, I think, he shifts into a sort of moral quietism. He realizes that he can't initiate positive transformations in his society, but that the best he can do then is to try to preserve his teachings, to keep them alive, to try to maintain a fragile thread of tradition in the hope that in the future, good things can happen. So you get lots of blending of the stances together. I mean, you do find people who occupy one stance. For example, David Cooper is a quietist. He explains this in his book. But you do find mixing and matching. And I also think there can be other stances that I haven't thought of or I haven't identified. So Judith Shklar, the American philosopher, she describes a a range of misanthropic stances, but doesn't say very much about them. You know, she says there's a kind of a sarcastic misanthrope, there's a sardonic misanthrope. So there can be other ways of being a misanthrope. And I imagine that if you really went hunting in the history of philosophy and theology, you would find lots of these examples. People wouldn't usually call them misanthropic because not many people use that word. But if you understand these as ways of living informed by a vision of humankind as collectively dreadful, you would probably find them. So I described 4, but there will be others, and they do merge together. And one of the very interesting things about studying misanthropy is to see how people fuse the doctrines together. So the Buddhist teachings on monastic life fuse together quietism with fugitivism. Whereas, for Kongzi, there are other reasons why he wants to merge activism and quietism. He feels a profound moral obligation to try to restore the way of life of the Zhou dynasty. So he feels compelled to be an activist because that's what a good person does. If you're a Confucian, you work hard for the benefit of your society, but then realizes, partly through encounters with some what might be Taoist sages, this is not going to succeed, and it's all right to become a quietist if you tried and failed again and again and again to be an activist. And it's partly those blendings and mixings that interest me. And that's why I'm always on the hunt for more examples of misanthropes.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to you coming up with a lot more interesting ideas about how someone, could practice to be a misanthrope. Santosh, I want to let you have a chance to ask a question. But before that, right, I just want to say one quick thing, because I learned this while reading your work, Ian, and it just struck me as an epiphany. So I think Confucius would bemoan and complain about rulers, right? And I think he would say how they don't take virtue seriously or something to that effect. And it just hit me like, I'm going to speak strictly about Singapore, but local politicians here, they don't bemoan about the state of society. They bemoan about their pay not being high enough. And they basically complain about certain things that I don't think a ruler should be complaining about. Basically, I feel they lack wisdom. So it just hit me like that I should be evaluating leaders based on what they're complaining about and whether they're doing something serious for it. Santosh, why don't you ask a question? And then I actually want to go into something else, which is your essay on exemplarism. So Santosh, go ahead.
Yes. If I could offer an additional perspective to the range of perspectives you've studied, which are Buddhist, Taoist, it's also the yogic, and that's from Hindu philosophy. And in there, you have also the blend of the quietist and the activist. And the yogic path as espoused in the Bhagavad Gita through Karma Yoga, chapter 3 of the Bhagavad Gita, it's a call to be in the world and yet not be of it. So to act, to have dedicated, full service-oriented action towards the world, but to be detached from the outcome of one's actions. And therein lies the beautiful blending between acting and also retreating and not being too caught up and attached to the fruits of one's actions. And so that's the beautiful idea of yoga. And in the whole philosophy of yoga, you have practices which are aimed at calibrating the best proportions and mix between the quietist and the activist. So for me personally, I lived my entire 20s with a very strong focus on the activist because I didn't learn the quietist. So I was very heavily focused on the activist. But that caused a lot of pain or burnout in a way. But only as I transitioned to my 30s where I realized actually you can do some contemplative breath work, meditative practices that help you find a better equilibrium. And that's where in the mornings we do some of the quietest rituals of yoga practice, somatic work, breath work, and kriya. And that prepares us to get into the world, to do acts of service before coming back home, to get back into a state of quietus and retreat, to recalibrate. Yeah. And once every 2-3 months, we do a silent retreat. We go back, we disconnect from the entire world in a silent retreat. So no social connections, no internet connection. And we go deep within ourselves to recharge. And that's for a period of 3-4 days, or a week, or let's say a month. Yeah. So there is this dynamic blending, as you mentioned, between the quietist, the retreat, the activist.
Activists.
And I think, yeah, it's up to everyone to find their unique proportions or weights across these different modalities, yeah, or stances, as you've mentioned. Yeah, so that's the yogic path. In the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu, it's this beautiful interplay between the yin and the yang, which are present in all things. And what they say is the opposing forces must be balanced the right way in order to achieve harmony. Yeah, and that symbol of the black and the white. And within the black, there is a tinge of white. And within the white, there is a tinge of black, which is the yin and the yang. The yin referring to the dark, and the yang referring to the light. And what they're saying is the existence of one is dependent on the other. And there's this beautiful harmony between both, which moves us away from this false dichotomy and this very unhealthy binary discussion of good, bad, right, and wrong, where we can see a spectrum of possibilities opening up between both, shades of gray opening up, yeah, or this duality, like this non-duality, yeah, of the darkness and the light, and them being at play within every individual human being. Yeah, so those were like some things that came to my mind from Eastern philosophy again. One from the philosophy of yoga, so the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali and the Bhagavad Gita, which has got 18 chapters of yoga. And then the other one, which is the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. Yeah, so those are like two things that came to my mind, which actually can very well gel and that can connect very beautifully with your false stances.
Yeah, actually, Ian gave a talk on Daoism. So I have a sense from you, Ian, that you seem to have some favoritism towards that philosophy.
I think my sympathies are with some kind of quietism. Not because I think misanthropy inevitably points towards quietism. That just seems to be the style of misanthropy that attracts me. In fact, it's interesting that a lot of the modern philosophical misanthropes, like myself, David Cooper, Kate Norlock, David Benatar, they all seem to lean towards some form of quietism. I mean, Benatar calls his pragmatic pessimism, but quietism does seem to be an option. But I'm thinking Santosh makes me think that maybe there are at least kind of two different ways to think about quietism. Within certain traditions, maybe the yogic tradition, quietism can be understood as an integrated aspect of a wider structure of life, where there are sort of, as it were, quietistic periods and dimensions of your life interstructured with kind of more activist, engaged dimensions, and where the ideal would be a sort of a constant toggling back and forth between these as part of the overall structure and rhythm of a human life. But maybe that's distinct from maybe certain forms of, say, Taoist quietism, because there was a strong cultural pressure during the period of the warring states that people ought to participate in public life. The default mode should be some form of engaged activism. And of course, there are many examples where, particularly Zhuangzi, is very emphatic that he will not get involved in social and political affairs. I'm thinking of the famous story of when two messengers come to him to invite him to be, I think, prime minister of one of the states. And he's fishing, and without turning to look at them, tells them a story and says, in the grand ancestral temple, there's an ancient tortoise, long dead, wrapped in silk in a lacquered box at the very highest altar. He says, do you think that tortoise would rather be dead and wrapped in silk in the temple, or alive and dragging its tail through the mud? And the messengers say, well, it would probably prefer to be alive and dragging its tail through the mud. And he says, then go away. I will drag my tail through the mud. And I take that as a powerful symbolic rejection of the ideal of a certain kind of activism. It says, I will not get involved in the affairs of this state. I will not participate in your collective projects. I'm going to live a kind of quietistic life, which is separate and opposed to the overall rhythms and norms of this society. He's really saying, I'm not going to be one of those over-enthusiastic Confucians who wear the official robes and try to work hard for the benefit of the people. He says, I'm going to live a quietistic life, separate from the masses, still part of the world, but living on the edges, not out in the mountains, but in the world, but not bound to it. So maybe there are two different types of quietism. There's the kind of quietism which is integrated into a wider pattern of life, which is socially recognized. And then maybe those maybe slightly more anarchistic quietists who adopt quietistic ways of life as a way of signaling their distancing from the wider stream of life. Another example might be the Epicureans in ancient Greece. You know, they are reluctantly part of the world, but they only participate in it in certain cases under certain conditions. Otherwise, they live a secluded way of life. And, you know, it's an interesting example of lots of the Taoist sages. They live very inconspicuous lives. Often you don't even realize they're there. You know, so the Analects, for example, is full of examples of recluse sages who appear to be very ordinary people like farmers or, you know, guards at the gate, but they reveal themselves to be people of profound wisdom by subtly signaling to Kongzi that they have an insight into the way. So maybe there are two sorts of quietists, sort of integrated quietists, maybe like the yogics, and then secluded quietists. And I suppose my preference is for maybe the first sort of quietist. I still want to be integrated with the world. I don't want to be totally secluded, but I'm caught between those two sorts of quietism.
I probably will go more. I probably will shift to the second one once I'm 60 and 70 and above. But yeah, but I was going to say actually the Zhuangzi story also resonated with me because I used to work in the government, and so I got disillusioned with the kind of work that I was doing. I mean, I still believe that what I contribute to the government still benefits society as a whole. But yeah, but similarly, now that you've managed to explain that anecdotal story, yeah, I went through a very similar journey of like kind of escaping from there and trying to do my own thing with this, obviously with this YouTube channel and, you know, my own individual efforts. And I think this is actually good. Is a good segue into other stuff I want to talk about, which is you have an essay which I read, exemplarism, adversity, and I think the third word is wisdom. But in any case, I have a question which I don't think you've been asked, which is should the misanthrope, given how much she, you know, cares about the state of humanity and is acutely aware of our deficiencies, and, you know, regardless of whatever stances he adopts and wrestles with, right? Should he strive to be a moral exemplar? And I'm actually thinking of trying to juxtapose this with two philosophers, Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. And of course, with the former, he advocated for a much more retreatist, ascetic way of living, while obviously the latter disagreed vehemently and argued for a much more forceful, you know, endure suffering and overcome, you know, this superficial dichotomy of good and bad and create your own set of values. So I'm curious to ask whether you think the misanthrope has that kind of unique responsibility. It's something I ask myself.
Interesting question. Well, I suppose I mean, very generally stated, an exemplar is someone who acts as a model for maybe a virtue or a certain role in life. Like, you know, they can be an exemplary parent or an exemplary teacher. But I think the really interesting exemplars are the ones who are models for a whole way of life. You know, so, you know, Kongzi was a model for a certain way of life. Jesus was a model for a certain way of life. And I suppose in the case of misanthropes, it would really depend upon what their wider commitments were, because a misanthrope is never just a misanthrope. That won't be the only feature of their vision of human life. They'll have a whole wider structure of beliefs and convictions and outlooks and ideas, you know, right up to the level of a kind of a cosmological understanding of our place within the scheme of things. And that background structure will determine a misanthrope's attitudes towards exemplarism. For example, if you're a certain kind of quietist misanthrope, then your life strategy is to find ways of engaging with the human world in ways that are minimally corrupting, minimally destructive to you, while still letting you access the goods of a human life. So I think Zhuangzi was a quietist, but, you know, we know that he was married, he had children, he had close friends. He was still a part of his world. He wasn't a wild man living in the forests. He was living within the world, but in a very quietistic, inconspicuous way. You know, he was keeping his head down and navigating carefully through a human world he found so violent. Now, in that case, that sort of misanthrope will not want to be a public exemplar, because the whole idea is to avoid recognition by other people. Because if people recognize you, they'll try to draw you into the world. They will seek you out. You know, there are lots of very amusing stories of the early Christian desert fathers who would retreat into the desert to find periods of isolation for spiritual practice, and then find lots of people coming to visit them, asking for guidance and advice and support. So some types of misanthropes will not want to be exemplars at all. They will want to be completely invisible, totally unrecognized. Or maybe, like the recluses that Kongzi encounters, they will only reveal their special status to certain people. You know, so in many cases, you know, one of these recluses recognizes Kongzi, you know, famous person, and they choose to reveal to him that they are, you know, these hidden sages, only because they know that they can trust him, you know, to have a good philosophical conversation. So some misanthropes will not want to be exemplars at all. They will want to be totally invisible and concealed, because that's their life strategy. They want to avoid entanglements with the world. Now, other misanthropes, of course, will want to be exemplars. So here, the example would be someone like Kongzi. You know, in order for him to do his activist work, he needs to recruit. He needs disciples. He needs people to share the moral work, people that he can train and then send off out into the world to do good things. So he has to be an exemplar, because one thing a public exemplar does is that they attract people. You know, people get interested in them. People hear about them. They hear about how amazing and virtuous they are. So they seek them out. And once you attract these people, then you can recruit them, and you need to do that in order to do your moral work. I suppose Jesus is another example. You know, many exemplars recruit disciples. They form communities, like the Buddha with his Sangha. So some kinds of misanthrope will need to recruit, and they need to be public exemplars. So Kongzi, Jesus, the Buddha, they need people. They need a team in order to do their moral and spiritual work. And so I think some misanthropes will want to be exemplars. They will want to do so for practical reasons, to recruit. And I suppose maybe a last thought here is that some exemplars might also want to be, some misanthropes want to be exemplars so that they can symbolize a certain truth about the world. You know, a misanthrope might recognize, I'm not going to convert many people. People will push back against misanthropy. People want cheerful, upbeat, happy visions of human life. You know, they want Rutger Bregman to tell them a happy story about how we're getting better all the time. They don't want a misanthropic vision of the world that they will find gloomy, depressing, and disheartening. But still, it's important for people to know that is an option. So some misanthropes could be symbols or exemplars of an alternative way of looking at the world, a way that they recognize most people will resist, but it's important that they know. So speaking to my students over the last couple of years, when I teach misanthropy, most of them said, I didn't even know this was a thing. Like, I didn't even know that this was a way of thinking about the world. And I thought it was important to teach them misanthropy to reveal to them this possibility. Like, there is another way of looking at the world. It's not pessimism, and it's not nihilism, and it's not just gloomy complaining. There is this other philosophically rich way of thinking about the moral condition of human beings called misanthropy. And I think some misanthropes are a model of that. They're not being exemplars to recruit people, because they don't think that will happen, but they are acting as living symbols of a truth about the world as they see it. And it's important to them to signify this truth. You know, so these misanthropes are not there to recruit, they're there to remind people, to make them aware there is this other opportunity, this other possibility for looking at the world. And I think those sorts of exemplar misanthropes are very interesting, because they'll have an element of pessimism. They recognize most people won't join, most people won't become misanthropes, but the most I can do for them is to introduce the possibility, to expand their imaginations just a little bit more, to encompass the possibility of misanthropy. And I'm thinking here maybe of the 20th century French writer, Emil Cioran, who's very pessimistic and very misanthropic. And in one of his notebooks, he says somewhere, often he says, you can't help people, you can't stop terrible things happening. The most you can do is to bear witness. You can stand up and say, things are this dreadful, these terrible things happened. We can't stop it, we can't stop it happening again. But at least we can stand up and say, I saw that, I recognize this. And he says there's a sort of solidarity here. You're telling the truth about the world. You are yourself a symbol of a certain kind of truth about the world. You are a misanthrope. And maybe the most you can do for people is to remind them there is this other possibility. And you might reject the possibility, you might not like the possibility, you might get very angry, but at least you've encountered it. And you encounter that possibility in the form of a misanthrope, like him. So the attitudes towards exemplarism will vary a lot, depending on the sort of misanthrope you are. And you have lots of options. You might want to conceal yourself and you'll be an invisible exemplar, no one will know. You can be a recruiting exemplar to get people on board, like Eco-misanthropes or Jesus or the Buddha or Kongzu. Or you could be these kind of symbolic misanthropes. You're an exemplar of a very different way of looking at the world.
Yeah, and one of the things that I took away from your essay as well is that exemplars don't have to be just confined to really legendary figures, religious figures like Jesus and Buddha, but you know, one of the things I think you mentioned is that even real living people or fictional characters, which I happen to have. So I think there's such a broad array of like various ways that you can look up to someone and kind of see how that can be a way to kind of model in your life while dealing with you know, all the dreadfulness with the world. And the other thing that I also was thinking of is that maybe exemplars themselves don't look to be an exemplar. They just happen to be one because a huge mass of people happen to recognize this one person. And I, for myself, like, am looking not at huge celebrities, but I try to look at much more smaller figure individualists, people who clearly are doing something good for the world, but they're not seeking fame and or they would never get it because, you know, they're not good looking enough, they're not rich enough. And so, you know, that's kind of like the way I also guide the way I look up to someone as a moral exemplar. Related to this, right, I actually want to bring up this thing that you wrote in your essay, which I feel is so important to talk about, which is the idea of right siding. So it's actually a concept that is from the American feminist Barbara Ehrenreich. And I'm just going to read out the definition: a determined emphasis on positive, inspiring, uplifting stories and people that tends to occlude the more negative dark sides of life due to submission to a culturally entrenched ideology of positive thinking. And you know what I like about what you said is that you can identify this phenomena when, again, quoting from you now, deviations from such optimistic scripts, such as talk of suffering, pain, loneliness, or resignation, are often policed and criticized, the dark sides being brushed out. And you know, these negative dimensions have to be acknowledged not only in the interest of truthfulness, but because exemplarity often shows itself when they loom large. So I was wondering if you can share, like, how should we be monitoring the bright siding of certain schools of thought? And I believe you have an essay on bright siding Buddhism. I mean, I can't access it, but would love you to talk about that because I feel that's so critical. Like, I think, as you mentioned just now, I think the kind of misanthrope that I am is that maybe I won't change the world, I won't improve on the world, but I want to communicate a certain truthfulness, and how people are going to deal with it, that's kind of their own thing. But you know, that's what I'm interested in.
Mm. Yes, bright siding is a good concept. It was introduced by Ehrenreich initially in the context of the ways that people talk about cancer, particularly in the United States. Ehrenreich has said herself had breast cancer, I think on 2 occasions. And she said so much of the discourse about cancer was just relentlessly one-sided and optimistic. It was all about being a hero, struggling, overcoming, battling, winning. Says all the rhetoric was about how cancer will make you stronger, better, kinder, more confident. You know, you will emerge happier, healthier, sexier, a better you than you've ever been. And Ehrenreich said this was so strange because it left out, he says, all of the bad stuff, like the anger and the frustration and the sadness and the pain and the awful feelings of loss. And when I read her discussions, I thought this is a certain failure of truthfulness. And it's not just one-sidedness, it's this more complicated effort to falsify the realities of human life by only paying attention to the good sides, by emphasizing them, by downplaying the bad sides, by ignoring the bad sides, by glossing over them or dismissing them as trivial or as secondary. And of course, in the case of illness, that's dreadful because many experiences of illness are really, really complicated. There might be some good things, like, you know, maybe you did learn more patience. Maybe you did acquire a sense of what really matters in life. But there will be a lot of bad stuff as well. You know, I'm thinking the American cyclist Lance Armstrong, you know, said of his testicular cancer, it was the best thing that ever happened to me. So that's a fascinating thing to say, especially because he's married and has children. I would have thought they were the best things that happened to him. Yeah. But as Ehrenreich says, there is a very profound psychological and cultural pressure to bright side. And this often takes the form of ignoring or dismissing or explaining away the negative dimensions of human life. The problem is human life doesn't consist of a constant series of positive experiences. It consists of a whole messy torrent of experiences that couldn't even be described as good or as bad, especially in cases of illness where lots of the positives, like you know, learning more about yourself, are tied up with the negatives, like realizing, you know, maybe, you know, just how selfish you were or how much time you wasted. And I want to use the concept of bright-siding more generally and, among other things, connect it to misanthropy. So I think that a lot of what we see amongst philosophical philanthropes is bright-siding. They are bright-siding human life and human history by ignoring our failings, by dismissing them, glossing over them, explaining them away, and constantly telling these very, very attractive, cheerful, upbeat, happy stories about how actually it's all been much better than you think. And it is much better than you think, and it's going to get much better. You know, one example of this may be, you know, in Bregman's book, Humankind, he says at one point, you know, slavery has been abolished, you know, hooray. The problem is that's not what the United Nations says. You know, the United Nations says there are still at least, I think, 75 million enslaved human beings in the world. And there's at least 150 million child slaves, most of them children. Now, in that case, has slavery been abolished? Well, maybe legally it's been abolished in many countries, but there are still hundreds of millions of enslaved human beings. And that's a very awkward, distressing fact. But it's a fact that has to be in the picture if you're going to have any serious reckoning with human life. So that's one crude sort of bright siding. You just don't mention the bad stuff. But, you know, as Ehrenreich says, there are many subtle forms of bright siding, like insisting that whenever anything bad happens, something good happens to kind of cancel it out, or insisting that in the end, all things come good, or insisting that there's always, you know, a lot of struggle and difficulty, but it will make you better. And I think that bright siding is an extremely common phenomenon. And I think a lot of it drives anti-misanthropy, because people don't want that sort of vision of the world, a vision of the world which is not just grimmer and more negative, but a vision of the world which is just much messier, much more complicated. You have to confront and think about and reckon with all the aspects of the world that you'd usually rather ignore. And here, I suppose, Cooper's book, Animals and Misanthropy, is very instructive. You know, David emphasizes that we show many, many vices towards animals: cruelty, callousness, selfishness. Our vanity and our greed drive lots of abuse of animals. But David also emphasizes that there are other failings that work to conceal the awfulness of what we do, like, you know, self-serving ignorance, turning away from the realities of animal agriculture, not asking what happens inside abattoirs, or, you know, not asking yourself the question, you know, if the supermarket can sell me 4 chicken breasts for £4, what sort of life did that animal have if they can sell it at a profit for such a small amount of money? You know, what you see in a lot of our treatment of animals is people systematically closing their eyes, not asking questions, not wanting to know, constantly turning away from the truth of the world. And that, I think, is the core of bright siding. It's an effort to turn away from the messy, uncomfortable truth about the human world, whether it's the awfulness of illness, how we abuse and mistreat animals, or turning away from the truth about just how complicated and messy and dreadful our moral performances as a species, as a culture. You know, I think bright siding is one of the big failings that a misanthrope wants to challenge by saying, you know, set aside these glossy stories, set aside these happy narratives about moral progress. Let's take an honest, sober look about the moral realities of human life. Let's look at how we abuse and exploit animals. Let's look at how we abuse and exploit members of marginalized social groups. Let's look at structural racism. Let's look at disparities in healthcare for transgender patients. Let's look at systematically at all the violence, waste, greed, enmity, hostility, and all the other failings built into the human world. Let's confront them and let's be honest about them. And on the basis of that, then we can consider the misanthropic verdict. And when you put it like that, it's very clear why people don't tend to want to do it. They need those illusions if they're going to live well. And this is, of course, a point made by Nietzsche. You know, people need these illusions to live the sort of life that they're living. And people will become very defensive if you try to peel those illusions away, because people prefer simple stories and easy explanations. And in particular, as the Buddha emphasizes, people prefer explanations of things that flatter them. People prefer explanations of the world which emphasize, you human beings are good people. You're kind by nature. You're fundamentally good. You're fundamentally decent people. That's a story that we want to hear because it flatters our egos and it reduces a sense of urgency to actually do anything. You know, if we're essentially good people, then in the end, good will out. The world will get better. And of course, the activist misanthrope says, well, no, it's not going to get better unless we do things. But we're not going to have the motivation to act unless we have a really strong sense it's dreadful out there, which is what you see in climate change discourses. So here is a case where there are certain failings that we show in how we relate to misanthropy by ignoring it, by dismissing it, by ridiculing it, by treating it as a mental illness or as a sign of a gloomy personality, or by in other ways dismissing it and rejecting it. I mean, the misanthrope is not trying to depress people. You know, the proper misanthropes are trying to encourage a more truthful reckoning with the realities of what it means to be a human being in a world like this. And they might be being truthful to guide action, or they might be being truthful just because they think the truth matters. Even if we can't do anything, even if it is going to get worse, the least we can be is to be truthful. And, you know, as Emil Cioran says, maybe the most we can do is to bear witness to all of the awfulness, harm, and suffering that we're generating. Maybe we can't help those people, maybe we can't help those animals, but the least we can do is to become aware of their suffering. And that might be the most we can do for them. And it might not be very much, but that itself would be a testament to the truth of misanthropy.
Oh, like I said, you took the words out of my mouth. There's one way I kind of try to illustrate this, and feel free to evaluate me about whether I'm doing the right thing. One of the ways I try to ask people to think about their complicity in suffering and, just making the world not such a good place is just think of the fact that we buy a smartphone. I'm using a smartphone right now to talk to you, but I'm acutely aware that the parts that are made, that are used to make the smartphone come from child slavery, if I'm not wrong, in Africa. I mean, cobalt is one of the minerals being used to manufacture all the components that we use for our electronics. There's also one time I shared an article which was about fast fashion and clothes, like people buying clothes and how unknowingly, and in this sense, it's a moral failing on their part. They're ignorant of the idea that what happens also is that Africa receives a huge bucket load. Literally tons of wasted clothes, and we are basically just spending so easily on fast fashion and then discarding it and then just leaving it like trash to people in poor countries to pick up, as if that's a form of blessing for them. And that kind of truth, as you mentioned just now, Ian, maybe we can't do very much about. Well, we could obviously choose to spend less, but obviously it's very hard to change the system, and that's kind of like how I feel. A misanthrope is more emotionally prepared to confront that kind of truth. The other thing I want to ask you about is also because this word has been used a lot in our discussion on misanthropy, which is the idea of hatred. And of course, you mentioned Immanuel Kant and how he looked at the enemy misanthrope as kind of not a very good model, right? Because he practices hatred of mankind. And of course, Andrew Gibson, as you mentioned, felt that it's contradictory to hate mankind because the misanthrope is human himself. And I thought a lot about that, and I felt I wasn't satisfied with it because in some sense I do hate. I hate myself too. And I'm also very aware of the target of my hate. As you mentioned, the misanthrope is not trying to hate individual human beings. So if I see, say, a friend of mine and his, materialistically shopping for clothes and shoes and all that, I mean, I don't hate him as a person. I just hate the fact that he's in a system that he doesn't understand. And he's also practicing a moral failing that I feel society does not condone. So does not condemn, sorry, right? And the reason why I even thought about it that way is because there's this book by Maisha Cherry. She's a American philosopher, and she has this book on rage or anger as an emotion to boost anti-racist struggle. And I felt like hatred should be treated in a much more complex sort of way. It's not so simple, and it's not so like a blanket term that, you know, when you hate someone, that necessarily you want to inflict violence and you want to see this person's life get screwed. I mean, that's really not the case. There are many, I mean, even the Christian saying, right, hate the sin, not the sinner. So I mean, I think there's ways to practice a kind of a healthy form of hate. In my case, I would call it self-hate. You know, because I hate myself for not being more capable, articulate, smarter, more charismatic, as smart as you. You know, and yeah, I just think that, you know, hate doesn't seem like it's such a simple bias. Just as you said, you know, life is complicated.
Yeah, well, I think this is a case where there are at least two problems with Kant's discussion of kind of hateful misanthropy. I mean, the first point is very general. It's that no one's inner moral life is so simple that it could be characterized by a single emotion. You know, he says, you know, the enemy is dominated by hatred, but you know, you point out, no one's moral life is that simple. You'll find a complex structure of emotions all interacting, anger, frustration, etc. Partly because, you know, one emotion can activate many, many others. You know, emotions get tied up with patterns of thought and reflection and judgment. You know, you see something dreadful happening, you feel angry. Then you start to wonder why people do these things. And then you start to get reflective, and then you realize that people often do these things because they don't know any better, because the world is so messed up. And then you feel frustrated and disappointed and bitter, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there are complex emotional dynamics which Kant doesn't seem to describe. Second problem is that Kant doesn't really say very much about what he means by hatred. You know, I mean, usually philosophers like to define their terms at length, but when Kant talks about hatred, he doesn't really say very much about what it is. For example, you know, he ignores the point that there can be different kinds of anger and hatred. You know, you can hate different things for different reasons. I mean, hatred has objects and it has forms. You know, I mean, the Buddha is very good at distinguishing different kinds of hatred by their objects, by their intensity, by their possibility to become morally good emotions over time. You know, maybe what Maisha is trying to do is to point to certain kinds of maybe virtuous hatred or virtuous anger, because there's a long tradition in feminist philosophy of trying to reclaim anger and hatred as positive moral emotions. And Kant doesn't do any of that. I mean, in the things that I've written on misanthropy, I struggled actually to find examples of hateful misanthropes. I mean, the closest example I found was a radical environmentalist group in the United States in the 1980s called Earth First. And, you know, they came out with some quite radical remarks about, you know, that there are too many human beings. We need to take radical action. Human beings are a cancer upon the world. They should be got rid of. But if you dig deeply into their writings, it turns out they're not really misanthropic at all. They just turned out to be racist and homophobic, because it wasn't all human beings they wanted to get rid of. It was specifically gay Americans and Africans living in less economically developed circumstances. They were the ones they wanted to harm and get rid of. It wasn't all human beings, it was specific human beings. And so that's a case where people who present as misanthropes turn out not to be haters of humankind, they turn out to be people who hate gays and hate poor people in Africa. And I'm still looking around for examples where there can be forms of complexly structured moral hatred that can be a part of misanthropy. And maybe actually it's in people like Maisha Cherry that you're going to find it, because in many cases, anger and hatred will be appropriate responses to the moral realities of human life. You see this all the time in animal environmental ethics. I'm thinking of, you know, Greta Thunberg getting very angry, denouncing, you know, your generation for screwing over our generation. You know, anger can serve those constructive moral emotion, those constructive and moral functions. And this might be a case where it does depend upon who the misanthrope is. You know, so if you're the Buddha, for instance, then anger and hatred are ruled out by the 5 precepts and by the Buddha's structures of teachings. He cannot endorse anger and hatred. So that's ruled out if you're a Buddhist misanthrope. But if you're another kind of misanthrope, maybe a feminist misanthrope, then maybe you could operationalize anger and hatred, you could put them to work. And again, this is a case where you have to look at specific misanthropes, because we can talk in general about misanthropes, but in order to say anything really useful, you have to talk about specific misanthropes in their own context, their own circumstances, and their own traditions. It is a very general moral category, but there are big differences amongst different misanthropes. And one difference will be their views on the idea that you could use anger and hatred for constructive purposes. The Buddha would say, absolutely not. That's one of the unwholesome roots, is aversion and hatred. Many other misanthropes say, no, we can use those negative moral emotions for positive functions. It's not easy, and it might have severe costs, but it can be done. And again, this is a case where there's lots to say about misanthropy. If you plug it into feminist philosophy, environmental philosophy, social philosophy, specific religions, cultures, and activist traditions and movements, there's a lot of potential in this topic.
So I just want to keep track of time. Ian, do you still have time, or do you have to go out soon?
I've got till about 10 past 1, then I should go to class.
Okay, cool. Okay, I just maybe try to wrap it up quick, but yeah, wow, I have a couple of comments. Santosh, do you want to say something first before I go, or?
Examine the root causes of bright-sidism, and what came to my mind was the whole neoliberal movement, which was a very strong political idea which caused nation states to grow and develop. And underpinning that ideology of neoliberalism, it was produce and consume. Yeah. So you don't just need people to produce for an economy. You need people to consume those goods. And a huge part of getting people to consume those goods was advertising and marketing, which was actually putting people under a trance and a spell that if you consume this, and if you took this, then it will make you feel better. And I think from then onwards, we forgot to realize, if I bought a t-shirt, once I'm done with it at the end of its shelf life and I throw it down the chute, I don't know what happens to it. Out of sight, meaning out of mind. This was, in my opinion, a very important part of the political ideology of the economic, the political ideology of maintaining neoliberalist thinking within the citizens, which is to keep them under this trance, like purchase and consume them, but don't see what happens after your consumption, meaning the products go down to the landfills, and what that happens after that, it's out of sight, out of mind. And I want to keep you under this trance and illusion of bright-sidism as much as possible, without you looking at the externalities, the negative externalities of growth, development, production, and consumption. Yeah, I think a lot of this politically motivated and influenced. Now only as we see the effects of the damage caused by neoliberalist thinking and capitalism, that's where we can see what kind of damage we've caused our societies. We were under this illusion, and I hope through this entire show, this show, it's called Breaking the Spell. So that's the neoliberalism. Entropy can help to break. So that came to my mind, I think.
Okay, Santosh, you're kind of breaking up a little bit. Can you just see if we can get a better internet connection? We still managed to hear most of what you said. Okay. Ian, you got a response first?
Yeah, I think that's right, because I think that people's willingness to take seriously misanthropy will partly depend upon the realities of their own life. I mean, if their life is violent, selfish, unstable, etc., that will start people thinking about misanthropy. But also, if you have social and political cultures where people have concepts like, I don't know, patriarchy, neoliberalism, concepts that guide their thinking onto social structures, that also opens a way for people to start thinking about misanthropy. Because I suppose if you're going to become a misanthrope, what you need is experiences of your own that guide you towards misanthropy, but also concepts and ways of thinking. And for example, when I teach my students, it seems to me that they're already warmed up into thinking like misanthropes, because they're so used to thinking in terms of capitalism, feminism, patriarchy, they already have structural ways of thinking because they're millennials and that's the world that they live in. And so they are primed to be misanthropes. And, it does seem to be a feature of many modern misanthropes. They point to the awfulness of our world, and then they tell explanatory stories about how it came to be like this, that involve, among other things, the entrenchment of certain forms of aggressive, rapacious capitalism. In fact, there is a long tradition of moral criticism of capitalism that invokes various vices and failings like greediness, selfishness, unsustainability, exploitativeness, mercilessness. Those sorts of moral critiques, I think, can prepare people for misanthropy, where you can say, what you're saying here about capitalism as we know it is also true about the world as such. And that's why I think in certain senses, the time has come for misanthropy, because people are already thinking in these large, complex, structural ways about the moral awfulness of human life. What misanthropy does is gather all of these things together and say, all of these things are evidence for what we're going to call this verdict on humankind. It's not just the destruction of the environment. It's not just exploitative working conditions. It's not just systematic injustice. It's not just neoliberal capitalism destroying all that's good in the world. All of these things together, seen as expressions of a common phenomena, that delivers you misanthropy. And I think that's why you see so much misanthropy under the surface in a lot of other critical discourses. People are not using the word, but that's clearly the end point of their reflections.
Okay, so I'm going to try to wrap this up with 3 types of comments. So let me try to do this quick. So the first thing I want to say is that, we haven't even broached the question of how should one respond to misanthropy. And certainly one of the things you brought up is friendship, because a misanthrope can find in his social circle, or his or her social circle, certain individuals that are morally exemplars, and they are indicative of something good to believe in, at least with certain individuals. And when I was reflecting on this question, I realized that, as I said in my introduction, I actually have been hanging around with quite a lot of misanthropes. And what you mentioned just now about how you don't find this sentiment of hating human beings really reflected in philosophical discourse. Well, it's definitely reflected a lot with the people around me. So, for example, I'm reminded of an old friend of mine who is someone who had this expression. She said that love is an illusion that nature plays for men to reproduce. So it's a very negative view about love and relationships. I have friends who, when they scroll through Facebook, they see something very disgusting, like a certain video that displays empathy or violence, and then they will leave sarcastic comments like, I hope this person gets run over by a car. Human beings are selfish pricks. The world will be much better off if we get our act together, or if we are totally eliminated. And actually, the funny thing for me is that even when I read some of these things, even I get a little bit turned off. Like, there's a certain tolerance that I even have about misanthropy, that there is so much that I understand. There's so much that is so nuanced about how much hatred there should be, or how you should lay fault and responsibility to people. And so I realized that actually, even when it comes to friendships, I have friends who are misanthropes. Then the second comment I have to make is because I want to get into popular, whether you've seen popular media representations of misanthropy. And I just want to give you an example right now, so because we are running out of time, which I think that the film The Joker, played by Joaquin Phoenix, I think it's a very beautiful illustration. So I'm just going to give a quick rundown. So spoiler alert, all right? Because the Joker in this film, he was depicted as kind of like an enemy misanthrope to me. Essentially, he was someone that was suffering from mental illness. He had delusions. He had social awkwardness. People ridiculed him, mocked him, bullied him. And his first instance of committing violence was actually when he was on the train and he was being picked on by Wall Street guys, and he accidentally shot them. So that's his first act of violence. But after that, right, he then grew to hate the people around him, and there was this atmosphere in the film that everyone was looking down on him, and there was this character played by Robert De Niro, and he would mock him in public. And when it came to a point in the film where his colleagues went to visit him, I mean, even when he killed one colleague and left the other one unscathed, he was very precise. He said, "Oh, you were nice to me, so I'm not going to kill you, but I killed the other guy because he was really mean to me at work." And it's like that selective exemplar, right? That kind of like, "Oh, you are a good guy, you are a bad guy." And yeah, and I think the other fascinating about the Joker film was that it really hit a certain vibe within perhaps within populace, but also fans of the film who felt like there was this illustration of the moral compass and behavior of a misanthrope, and you could see that even though, I mean, the ambiguity around our feelings around this film is that the Joker is not someone to support and to endorse, but there was something admirable or something very justifiable about what he did as a message to humanity. And so anyway, if you want to answer that question, whether you've seen other popular representations of misanthropy, I would love to hear that. Really, my last question to you, Ian. So I really regret that we didn't get into vice as epistemology. I really would like to get with you maybe for a second session on that. Let's see whether you're open to that. But my last question to you basically is, human beings, better that we were around or better that we're not?
I'll take the questions in order. I mean, on friendship, it's a misconception that a misanthrope can't have friends. I mean, it's perfectly clear that lots of the great misanthropes of history did have friends. I mean, I've mentioned, Kongzi, the Buddha, Zhuangzi. They all had friends. None of them were antisocial loners. I mean, Kongzi especially was clearly a very sociable person. They all have a very rich conception of what friendship is. And it's interesting that for many misanthropes, friendship is actually especially important, because for them, certain people will stand out for you as being especially and unusually good relative to the rest of us. If you're a misanthrope and you think collectively human life is dreadful, it will really strike you when you encounter human beings who are exceptions to that rule. Human beings who, despite all the corrupting forces of their world, are honest and kind and decent. They all stand out for you morally as good people, people worthy of friendship, precisely in contrast to your misanthropic evaluation. And you can perfectly well recognize that some people are good. I mean, that's not a contradiction, because a misanthrope's not judging individual people, they're judging human life, so human forms of life. And that's totally consistent with thinking that some people are very good. And for some misanthropes, it's quite moving, actually. They emphasize that genuine friendship might be your last and best defense against sliding into a totally hopeless, all-consuming misanthropy. So the French essayist Montaigne is a good example here. I mean, he was very misanthropic, but he says several times that it was his best friend, La Boétie. He says it was him, the memory of him, the memory of his kindness and his honesty and his decency, says that, he says, maintains my fragile trust in this thing called humankind, because I know that at least one of those human beings was a good person, kind of good with a capital G. And he said, it's my memory of my friend that preserves a very fragile trust in humankind. He says, and if that trust broke, he says, I would slide into a hopeless, bleak, despairing, hateful misanthropy, but I won't. And that's why I think that friendship has a special function for misanthropes, because when you're overwhelmed by the collective awfulness of everything around you and you think the human world is dreadful, it should just be burnt down. But then you remember, well, no, because there are pools of goodness in the world, little oases of goodness and virtue. And there are some good people. And those people signify the very fragile possibility that human beings are, at least sometimes, capable of goodness. And it's the memory of those people, or the presence of those people, as exemplars of human beings at their best, that protects you against a devastating nihilistic misanthropy. And I suppose that brings us to the Joker, because he is a very good example of a certain kind of enemy misanthrope. I mean, the Joker there has good reasons to regard the human world as cold, callous, violent, unselfish, and uncaring, because it is. And of course, the Joker feels that acutely because he's so vulnerable within that society. And a point that misanthropes want to mention is human beings aren't just cruel and violent. They're often cruel and violent to the people who are most powerless. You see this in the case of animals as well. I mean, what's awful about our treatment of animals is not just that we harm them and brutalize them, but they're so vulnerable to us. They're so much at our mercy, and we respond to them with violence and exploitation. So the Joker is a good example of a misanthrope, but he's not just, wildly emotionally misanthropic. I mean, his misanthropy is a judgment, it's a verdict, and one that in the early parts of the film, he tries to resist. He does desperately, pathetically try to think well of human beings, but individual people, social structures, institutions in the world constantly conspire to try to destroy him. And then, of course, eventually he responds to that by adopting this new persona, a certain exemplar of an enemy misanthrope, where there's no agenda. He doesn't want to reform the world. He just wants to treat it in the way that he thinks it ought to be treated, with violence, destruction, and instability, because he says the world doesn't deserve any better. So I think he's a good, vivid example of an enemy misanthrope. I mean, if you want another example of enemy misanthropes, a slightly lighter example, the demons in the television series The Good Place, they are misanthropic as well. I mean, the demons, of course, are working in hell. They're punishing human beings. But the demons in that show constantly report misanthropic judgments, that the human world is violent, brutal, selfish, narcissistic, vainglorious, hubristic, narrow-minded, selfish. It lacks empathy and sensitivity. All the demons there are very misanthropic. And of course, part of the narrative arc of that series is that one of the demons, Michael, gets initiated into a more complex understanding of human beings as, at least under certain conditions, capable of goodness. So they might be other examples of television misanthropes. And of course, the nice thing about the television series A Good Life is it's very philosophical. It's written by people who know philosophy. And one of the characters, Chidi Adegonye, is a professor of moral philosophy. So there is explicit engagement. So there's a lot of misanthropy in The Good Place as well. And it constantly resists this one-sidedness. We're all dreadful, or we're all good. They say, well, no, goodness is fragile. Goodness is only possible under certain complicated conditions that involve good luck, supportive social structures, friendship, relationships of love and trust, moral inspiration and guidance from moral or religious traditions. All of these things have to be in place and carefully configured to create a possibility of goodness. And this is something that was emphasized by Aristotle and Kongzi and the Buddha. Goodness is not an achievement of individual people. Goodness is achieved through the reorganization of ways of life. So in one of the Confucian philosopher Munch's images, he says, vices are like weeds. They grow quickly and easily. They just spring up all the time and they're hard to get rid of. Virtues are like orchids. They're beautiful and wonderful, but extremely delicate. And it takes immense care and thoughtfulness to actually breed them and grow them. And I think that's a nice image. And I think that's part of the truth about misanthropy. Goodness is possible for human beings. It's just very, very, very fragile. There's a famous book in philosophy by Martha Nussbaum called The Fragility of Goodness, which makes this point. And as David Cooper says, no one's ever written a book called The Fragility of Badness, because badness is not fragile, it's robust. It generates itself easily, it fuels itself. Goodness is difficult, badness is hard. And for a misanthrope, that explains the history of humankind so far. It's the difficulties of goodness within this sort of world, a world that is increasingly hostile to goodness, a world that makes it harder and harder and harder to cultivate and express what's best about us, because it's constantly feeding what's worst about us. And I suppose if you're the Joker, you respond by trying to burn it all down because nothing can be done. I mean, the Joker is a nihilistic, misanthropic pessimist and very violent. But we can understand him. We don't sympathize, but we understand him. We understand why he's like that. And of course, understanding something is not the same as endorsing it. But we can see how that is an intelligible response to the world that he finds himself in. Not the ideal response, but it is an intelligible response. So that answers the points about friendship and the Joker. And I don't remember your third point.
Human beings, is it better that we were around or
Yes.
not?
Yes, that I think is a difficult question for many misanthropes. I mean, Cooper is very unequivocal. He says, no, he says the fact that human beings are dreadful doesn't mean it's better that we should be got rid of. I mean, there are anti-natalist misanthropes like David Benatar, for whom human life is so violent and destructive, it would be better off if we'd never been. And there is, of course, the voluntary human extinction movement. And I think I would see those as radical misanthropic activists. They think we're collectively dreadful. They want to take radical action to do something about how dreadful we are. But the radical action isn't improving us, it's bringing us to an end. So they are kind of extinctionists. Now, I don't endorse that, partly because I think that human beings do add something to the world, morally, aesthetically, and existentially. And also, I just don't think it's plausible that you would ever bring about our extinction. I mean, there are lots of things you could do to try to bring about human extinction, but none of them sound to me attractive or plausible. I mean, Benatar is very realistic about this. I mean, in his book, Better Never to Have Been, he says, our objective should be to reduce the human population to zero over a steady period of time through non-violent, non-coercive measures. But he says, I know that's not going to happen for cultural and psychological reasons. We are a pronatal society. And that's a sort of sober realism that you find in many misanthropes. So I think that the world is better off with us. But also I think it's just impossible that we would ever be got rid of, short of a catastrophe or a disaster if a comet smashes into the planet. And also maybe in a sort of romantic longing I have, I don't fully want to abandon the idea that we could be made better. I mean, it's very difficult, of course, to predict what the future of human beings will be like. Many misanthropes tell stories of inevitable decline, of our becoming inevitably worse. You know, Kongza tells the story of decline from the age of the sage kings. Christians have the story of our expulsion from the Garden of Eden. Jean-Jacques Rousseau has his story about how our world becomes ever more complicated over time. And there's a sort of inevitability about their pessimism. Things will get worse. Maybe they will, but maybe also the world might get better, maybe through human effort and endeavor, but maybe spontaneously or accidentally. You know, I wouldn't want to abandon the idea that we could be made better. What we should abandon is the idea that we can only get better through human effort. I think human effort often makes things worse, but the world could spontaneously improve in certain ways. You know, maybe there'll be, you know, future changes brought about by environmental change or about any number of other factors we cannot anticipate. So I wouldn't want to get rid of us. I don't think that's on the cards anyway, but I think that we should at least maintain the existence of this human species. The real challenge would be try to identify the most effective, least destructive ways of trying to cope with this, whether it's being activists or quietists, whether we all become fugitives. The one I would rule out is being an enemy, because that involves violence and destruction and harm causing. But that still gives us a lot of options to keep on the table. And as long as there are options, I think we should keep human beings in the game.
Wow. I was going to end with a pessimistic quote, but I won't do that. And I want to leave this session with such an inspirational note from our most esteemed misanthropist in this session, Ian James Kidd. Thank you so much for being with us and sharing so much insight and wisdom. I can't thank you enough. And I really hope to have a chance to either meet you in person or, you know, do this session again. There's one last question I have to ask because it pertains to your book. When is it going to be out?
I should have a first draft finished by Christmas, I hope. And then it'll probably take me a year to go. That's it.
Okay, so, I'll be the first one to buy it.
The end of
Okay. So you were breaking up a little bit there, but yeah, I'll be the first.
I will let you know when it's out.
Yeah, definitely looking forward to it. Thank you once again, Santosh, for coming on and sharing. Hope it's been beneficial to you.
It has been very insightful, and I really enjoyed this session. Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, I leave with a lot more hope than I expected to. Yeah, so I've got so much more hope. Like, it's so counterintuitive. Like, I came in with very little hope, but with misanthropy, I live with a lot more hope. Like, that's so counterintuitive. Yeah, it does the exact opposite.
Okay. Yes, it's not the gloomy doctrine that people present it as, and it can't be described as hopeless or despairing. There are hopeless kind of.
Okay, thanks so much, Ian, and I'm going to call this a close. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Douglas. Thank you, Santosh.